What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. So, before I get started, I want to apologize if you hear some banging. There's construction going on next door. Nothing I can do about that. I'm shooting this kind of on the fly. Also, I guess following on the apology line, this is probably going to be a bit rough and ready in terms of preparation. I have not done a ton of preparation. The stuff I'm going to be talking about was just announced today, I think, actually, as I'm recording this on Thursday. This will be airing on Friday. I've gone through the press releases and stuff like that to kind of get an idea of things, but I wanted to talk about some stuff because for a change, I think I'm actually somewhat excited about some stuff in the whole Canon and photography world as a whole. So, what we're talking about today is new lenses. Canon has announced 3 new lenses on the 2nd I think it's the 2nd, might have been the night of the 1st, but 3 new lenses on the 2nd here of November 2023, and I think there's something to talk about here because they actually look kind of interesting. Maybe not all of them, but sort of the whole thought process or the whole setup behind it. I'm kind of interested. So the 3 lenses that Canon released are the RF24-105 f2.8L IS USM Z, the RF200-800 f6.3-9 IS USM, and the RFS 10-18mm f4.5 to 6.3 IS STM. Now, I want to start talking about with the RFS 10-18 because honestly, of all these lenses, it's the one that I'm the least interested of. And Canon has done 10-18 focal lengths. They did it in EFS. I think they also did it in EFM, or maybe that was 11-22. That could have been 11-22. In any event, it's an ultra-wide-angle lens for a crop camera. So it's the equivalent of a 16-29mm full-frame angle of view, or full lens on a full-frame camera, angle of view-wise at least. I'm curious as to why Canon has seemingly abandoned the 10-22mm focal length range. I mean, I guess given that 18 to something is kind of the mid-range in the crops, so it goes 10-18, 18 to something, something to some bigger number. I guess maybe that's what the thought process is. Of course, abandoning that 10-22mm range does mean that they could make the lens smaller, which is definitely a plus if you're trying to make things small. Personally, and I've talked about this before in these videos, I still think the RFS mount is dumb. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Canon should have committed to making the RF cameras full frame, period. Given the fact that they sold the RP for less than $1,000, and the dynamic shift in the camera market, if you will, where most people who talk about the camera market are going to talk about it as the smartphones have eroded the camera market, and that's certainly one way to look at it, but I think everything is always a matter of perspective. So one way you can look at it is that, well, a lot of people aren't buying cameras because they have smartphones, and so smartphones have destroyed the camera market, but I don't think you honestly can say that with a straight face, at least when you're talking about interchangeable lens cameras. And no matter how many lenses Canon or Samsung or Sony or Apple put in their smartphone, a tiny sensor with a tiny lens is not the same as a big interchangeable lens camera. The way I look at the whole smartphone camera situation is I look at it as smartphones have completely decimated the entry-level camera position. So what does that mean? Well, obviously it means that people aren't buying point-and-shoots really anymore. But what it really means, the way I interpret it, is that the entry level has moved up tier. It's no longer, a point and shoot used to be the entry level point. Now it's an interchangeable lens camera that's the entry level point, because if that's not your level of interest in photography, you're not going to be buying that kind of camera. Okay, so with that said, why do I still think RFS is dumb? Well, from a user perspective, it's big, is what it really comes down to. The RF mount is so big because it's designed to be a super fast, full frame capable mount, and probably could support sensors larger than full frame, honestly, that it makes the cameras bigger than they really need to be, especially when you start talking about crop sensors. There is, for example, the EOS M3 or M6 they're the same form factor. You simply can't make a camera that small with an RF mount. It just can't be done. The mount, the physical diameter of the mount is bigger than the overall height of the EOS M3 or M6. So if the objective is to make a compact camera, then the EOS M platform really was what you want, because it was a smaller mount for a smaller sensor, or for the same size sensor, but it was a smaller mount that was designed more appropriately to that sensor. What this ends up meaning for the RF platform is, yeah, okay, Canon's got RFS lenses, and that's and crop RFS cameras, and that's, I guess, good for some, well, it's good for a couple of reasons, but not really on the end user facing side. But to make that all work, you end up with cameras that are bigger than they really need to be, and you end up with lenses that have huge honking lens mounts on the back that then neck down into a much smaller package. But because the lens mount's still a lens mount and it has to be the size that it is, the overall diameter of that lens in your bag or in a case or whatever isn't any smaller than the RF mount as a full frame or a full frame RF mount lens. And of course, Canon is clearly trying to make their RFS cameras and lenses small, and so they are removing things like the full suite of controls. They don't have physical switches on it, etc. Now, people will tell me, because I know there's people already running for the comments, that having RFS cameras and our EOS R camera, full frame and crop in the same platform, is actually really better. Because, well, the only real user-facing reason that this is better is that you could buy an RFS crop camera now with RFS crop lenses now, and then upgrade to a full frame EOS R camera at some point in the road and take your lenses with you. With the kind of caveat that, you know, your 24 or 32 megapixel RF crop camera, when you stick that lens on a 24 or 32 megapixel RF full frame camera, doesn't give you anywhere near the resolution that you were, or in terms of image size at least, that you were getting on the crop camera. I get it. It's a nice, there's a nice economy of thought in, well, I bought into the less expensive part of the system, the RF mount, and I'm going to transition, I know, down the road to a larger sensor in the RFS mount. I'm going to transition down the road to a larger sensor in the RF mount, and I want to be able to take my lenses with me. And that's not something that you could do with the EOS M, which has a completely different mount. The argument that I often see, which that's the best argument, the argument that I often see is it's too complicated and expensive for Canon to be able to maintain two different lines. And I don't quite think that's accurate. Reason for that is, from a R&D perspective, sensor doesn't matter. The sensor is the sensor. It doesn't matter what format camera or what lens mount it's going on to. If you're going to develop new technologies for the sensor, ideally you want to develop them in such a way that, well, we may implement this on the APS-C sensor today because we know in 2 or 3 years, when it's a little bit more refined or we have a little bit better manufacturing or whatever, we're going to implement that on the full frame sensor to cover, you know, to upgrade there. Vice versa, things like dual pixel AF implemented on a full frame sensor first, brought down to the smaller sensors, but they're still sensors. They're an entirely independent thing from the camera that they're put in, that it doesn't really matter. The rest of it is software, by and large. The only specific that would be shareable but aren't necessarily, because you have two different mounts and two different form factors, aspect of this is really the lens mounts themselves, the physical ring that you mount the camera to. None of these Canon cameras the cameras don't share chassis, so, you know, going from an R50 to an R5 or an R50 to an R7 or an R50 to an R3 or whatever. They're all completely different chassis, which is the case even if the mounts were different anyway. The optical designs of the lenses have to be designed anyway. I mean, it's just not something you can shirk around or you can change. If you're going to make new crop lenses, you have to design the crop lens, and it doesn't matter that much whether you put that on an EFM or an EOS R mount. Both of them are fine. But again, like I said, the problem is the RF platform just can't make the things small enough. And I really end up kind of questioning how necessary it is, or how it is a marketing thing, to have say a $700 APS-C camera compared to a $900 full frame camera. Like, given again what I was saying about the entry level is coming up, you know, I don't think that's as big of a hurdle for somebody who's trying to buy into a platform as maybe some people would want to make it out to be. But anyway, back to the lens. So it is really compact, and quite honestly, I'd almost argue that the 10 to 18 is a little too compact. The zoom ring is really small, and the combination focus control ring is even more compact and cramped, and the whole thing is tiny, all things considered at least. Which again goes back to this whole need for Canon to make small APS-C sized lenses for their RFS cameras to try to bring the entire size weight situation down, given that how big the lens mount is and how much the lens mount forces the camera to be bigger than it potentially needs to be in every market. Certainly, you know, I'm obviously biased. I'm American and I'm a guy, so I have reasonably big hands, which means I tend to like a larger camera. But on the same token, if you have, you know, targeting smart markets that generally have smaller people with smaller hands, big cameras are harder to hold. So Japan, China, Asia, typically people there are smaller than they are, say, in the US, and they tend to have smaller hands, although this is more of a generalization than anything. But I mean, it also applies to other places. My mom really loves her EOS M5 because it's super small and compact. And she does not really like any of the EOS RF or RF, whatever, EOS R crop cameras because they're just bigger. And it's not like, that trade-off doesn't really work for her. Anyway, compact, reasonably priced, I think, at $330. It's certainly cheaper than the 10 to 22 was, the EFS 10 to 22 was when I bought it, and I bought mine used for like $500, $400 and something 10 years ago. So, yeah, that looks pretty decent. And, you know, if you're a new user buying into the crop system with, you know, that wants an ultra wide lens, I don't think this is potentially a horrible option. The problem, of course, is how does it actually hold up in practice? Until I or multiple reviewers really get their hands on one of these, and I won't be getting one of these to test because I have no interest in this lens, and I just, yeah. Until multiple reviewers have their hands on this and have tested it, you know, it'll be an open question as to just where this lens stands in terms of image quality. And ultimately, for me, well, again, this is another position of bias or question of bias. For me, image quality is important, but for a lot of people, as long as the image quality is good enough, that may not be as important as it being as compact as it is. So that was more than I wanted to say about the 10 to 18 RFS, but hey, it is what it is. That brings me to the second lens that Canon announced, which is the RF 200 to 800 f6.3 to 9 IS USM. And this is also a pretty reasonably priced lens. So it's $1,900, which granted, is not is a lot of money for a lot of people, and not a lot of money if you're talking about big glass. The reality is that when you start talking about things like the 100 to 300 f2.8 at, I think it's $12,000 or $13,000, or maybe a bit more than that, $1,900 for this kind of range is not a bad price. And honestly, I'm far more interested in this lens than I thought I would be. I really didn't, when I first glanced at it or first looked at it, I really thought, okay, it's another kind of cheap consumer zoom. It's like 4 pounds. It is 4.5 pounds. I think it's fairly big, all things considered, but it is a 200 to 800 millimeter lens. So big is kind of goes with the course, is par for the course, I should say. But this looks like it's not, this doesn't actually look that bad to me. So it is compatible with Canon's RF, so teleconverters or extenders, so both the 1.4 and the 2x, which I thought was very unexpected for this not being an L lens and not being not being an L lens. I really didn't expect to see that. It's also built like an L lens, even though it doesn't carry that L moniker. It's white, which, we can argue about what that really means. Even if you're not doing it for fluorite, maintaining thermal stability for fluorite elements, I could understand why you would make a large telephoto lens like this white, even if it's not carrying the L moniker. Which this doesn't. So this is kind of an oddity in Canon's lens lineup, being a large white telephoto lens that is not an L lens. And, for example, the 600 f11 and 800 f11 that Canon released back when they started the EOS R platform, they weren't white. So, I'm kind of curious as to where that ends up being. The other thing that makes this kind of almost an L lens or a pseudo L lens. So we've got teleconverter compatibility, we've got white and large and telephoto, is that it's dust and weather sealed, which is fairly uncommon. I think this might be a first for non-L lenses from Canon. Now, I would make the argument that Canon should weather seal everything, that this should be a every lens should be built in such a way as to prevent dust and water from, at least rain, from getting in the lens. Not waterproof, obviously. You're not gonna I put my lens in the water in a river and it got flooded. Well, yeah, that's unrealistic without a waterproof housing, in my opinion. But I don't think you should ever have to worry about taking your camera out and shooting in a light rain, or if you get caught in a rainstorm and you just can't get to somewhere where you could put your camera away or get out of the rain, that's going to ruin your camera. So I have big props to Canon for weather sealing or making this lens weather resistant. And I think they should really do that basically with everything that they make. Now, there are, as far as I'm concerned, some big cons to this lens, but I'm not actually sure how much of an issue it is for me when all things, when I stop and think about it. So the aperture, 6.3 to f9, is diffraction limited pretty much everywhere. The EOS R5 at 45 megapixels is diffraction limited at f7.1. The R6 and R3, basically the 24 megapixel full frame cameras, are diffraction limited at higher than that. I think it's 8 or 10 or something like that. So if you put this lens on an R5, you're going to be diffraction limited at basically anything but wide open at 200 millimeters. If you're using an APS-C camera, where this becomes crazy long in terms of tight in terms of angle of view, then you're diffraction limited at f5.2 right now. That's all of the APS-C cameras in the EOS R platform. So you are diffraction limited straight up out of the box, wide open at any focal length off the chart or off the book, start. Now, diffraction isn't the end-all brick wall that it used to be. all of Canon's EOS R cameras have diffraction correction built into them at this point, and if you're shooting in JPEG or HEIF, then those cameras will be able to automatically apply that correction to basically undo the diffraction that's caused by the lens. And I did testing on this. Additionally, Canon's Digital Photo Professional software for processing on your computer also can do this. Now, I did testing back when Canon first announced this, put this out, and I was floored by how good it was. I could take a lens, stop it down to f/22, the picture was a blurry mess, run it through the diffraction correction, and get something that was really nice. So this isn't the end of the road, so to speak. This isn't the brick wall that it was. Like, you certainly couldn't fix this in film situations. But with digital, absolutely you can do something with it. The problem is, at least in my opinion, if you are like me and you use Photoshop Lightroom or Adobe Lightroom or whatever the heck they call it as your post-processing software. I don't use Canon's, I use Lightroom. It's way more efficient for me to use that. And this is a function that Adobe has consistently not added to Lightroom. It's in other software. I don't see any reason that they can't profile the lenses and build diffraction correction profiles for them. I would actually be not surprised to find that this information was already in, like the metadata, because distortion correction is stored in the metadata, even if it's not mandatorily enforced. That the diffraction correction information isn't somehow stored in the metadata and could be used. So not having this is in Lightroom, I think, is increasingly limiting for Adobe, this perspective, from my perspective with Adobe. And it's not just for this lens. When your camera's diffraction limited at f5.2, almost everything you shoot is going to end up requiring some form of diffraction correction. And as Canon is talking, or the rumor mill is talking about, a 60-something megapixel, 62 megapixel EOS R5 Mark II, which, again, I'm not in favor of. I think they should stay at 45 megapixels and just make the camera better. The diffraction limited aperture goes down, again, more so, or from where it is now for the R5, and you're even more dependent on diffraction correction. This is a limitation of physics, and it's one of those places where it can be corrected, but it's not being corrected universally in every post-processing program, and so it's not necessarily ideal. Now, that said, at least if you are using Topaz Photo AI or Topaz Sharpen AI, you can sharpen those images and it will deal with that, but it's not doing a profiled correction. So the difference being, in a profiled correction, you measure how basically you measure the transfer function, or you calculate a transfer function for how diffraction from that lens and aperture configuration distorts the image, and then you invert that to sharpen the image, basically the inverse of how the diffraction softened it. Whereas something like Topaz Photo AI or Sharpen AI is just applying sharpening with some machine learning tweaks to make it work better. The other thing I don't care for on this lens is the combo focus control ring. The 200 to 800 is obviously big enough to have a zoom, focus, and control ring. And, I was critical of this on the 10 to 22, although in that case, you could make a bit of a justification for not having 3 rings because of how small the lens is. But in this case, the lens is big. It's longer than the 100 to 500. And as a result, see, this is the frustration I have, because Canon having the control ring on the lens is certainly a plus. It's a good thing. It's better, more direct, easy access to control of a camera function. Aperture, shutter speed, exposure compensation, whatever you have it programmed to. The problem is, for it to be truly something that's useful and usable, it has to be consistently accessible and available across the board. Moving it around the way Canon does is problematic because you don't have consistent muscle memory to know where it's going to be or to move to where it's going to be. You have to learn that on basically a per lens basis. Not having it on some lenses or combining it with the focus ring on some lenses means that you don't have direct access to it. If you are, say, shooting manual focus and you want to change a setting, you have to flip a switch, change the, flip the switch to change what the control ring does. Turn the control ring, go back, flip a switch, and set the manual focus back. Now, I know Canon's probably the thought process here is that this isn't an L lens. Most people who use it are going to be shooting it autofocus. So your normal configuration is going to be control ring and zoom ring, and it's not a big deal. I mean, look at it. The control rings on these lenses are not complicated. They're rotary encoders. The control ring and the focus ring are not directly coupled to anything in the lens. It is a rotary encoder that feeds a signal into the processor on the lens that feeds a signal back to the camera. The cost to implement something like that is pretty minimal. Like, it's not going to be a $2,000 lens instead of an $1,800 or $1,900 lens because there's a second control ring on it. It didn't, as a cost-cutting measure, it's not going to make a difference. From a usability perspective, it makes a big difference. And it makes a big difference across the platform as a whole because it means you can rely on everything being there and directly accessible instead of having to switch things potentially in a rush on the fly in a field, or doing like what I do, where by and large I don't use the control rings at all on the lens. I use focus and zoom. So I mean, I would be fine in that respect from a practical perspective, but I use focus and zoom, and my control rings are set to, I think, exposure compensation, but I almost never use them because it just doesn't matter. Especially on a camera like the R5, where I have 3 dials on the camera, so I have shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, or directly under my thumb and finger. Having the ring on the camera is not so important. Now, if I was shooting with a camera like the R50, but those lower entry-level cameras where the 3 dials aren't exposed on the camera, I'd absolutely want the control ring to be available, and I would want to not have to, because I'd want to have it for something like aperture, or more likely shutter speed, because I tend to use the aperture on I tend to shoot in aperture priority, and I tend to use the aperture on the main dial on my camera, which you could do on those cameras as well. But I'd also want focus, because at least in my experience, there's an awful lot of times where I'm touching or making manual focus adjustments just because it's necessary for what I'm doing. Autofocus is great. Canon's autofocus works really well vast majority of the time, but there are situations, especially where I'm doing product work or I'm shooting something on a desk or something like that, where making minor corrections with manual focus is so much faster that, I like having the 3 things. I like having all of the major user interface elements: aperture, ISO, shutter speed, or exposure compensation, whatever. Focus, zoom, and if you're going to have a control ring, I really think it should be the thing that is there. But this is definitely an interesting lens. Again, the real thing that comes back to is to see how this actually plays out when they are out and in hands, and people who are doing reviews and resolution tests have their hands on this lens. If it is sharp, this could be a really killer lens. It's certainly almost $1,000. What is it, like $900, $800 less than the 100 to 500. It covers a 3x zoom range that goes out even further. And, if you can deal with the diffraction, and potentially if it's not as sharp as it could be, but I'm not even sure that that's like, I'm not holding my breath on it not being pretty good. Canon has done telephoto lenses really well for over a decade now. In fact, a little bit more, probably closer to 2 decades now. And yeah, Canon has done telephoto lenses really well for 2 decades now, at least. I would not be surprised, given the price, that this lens is a reasonably good performer, barring the diffraction issue. Now, the last lens that I wanted to talk about, the last lens of the trio, is the RF 24-105 f2.8L IS USM Z. And I am super interested in this lens. Now, if you follow Canon rumors, they have been talking a lot about the fact that people don't like the 70-200s that extend. They want an internal zoom 70-200, and that was coming. Clearly, I think maybe this was the lens that they thought was a 70-200. Maybe we'll see another 70-200 that is internal zoom. But this is very clearly a lens that is intended for video shooters. So the Z is the power indicates that it's compatible with power zoom adapters, which I'll talk about in a second. The fixed, internal zoom, internal focus design makes a ton of sense in a video context, especially if you're putting the camera on rails and you're going to have a matte box mounted on those rails. You can't have the lens and extend. The focus range, or the focal range, is completely reasonable and adequate for most video applications. So you have wide, you have, call it medium telephoto, I think is a good way to put it. There's plenty of, if you look at the Canon cinema lenses, and cinema lenses from varieties of companies, there's a lot of lenses that kind of fall in this range on a full frame sensor. And then you get into the things that really look like they were designed for video. So there is a clickless fine aperture control ring on the lens. I don't know how much I would use that, but if you are shooting video and you do need to make aperture adjustments, having a clickless fine aperture ring on the lens is solid. Now, this is not a mechanical aperture ring that connects to the aperture mechanism inside the lens. This is electronic. So it's going to require a firmware update. Canon says it's coming in December for supported cameras. Presumably the R5C will be on that list. I would not be surprised if the R3, the R5, the R3 and R5 would be on that list, and certainly all of the major in production, at least the R6 Mark II probably will also see firmware updates for that. Oh, and the C70, of course, on the video side. So the R5C, the C70, I'm betting the R3, probably the R5 and the R6 Mark II at a minimum are what I would expect to see updates for this, if not the whole product line. There's little reason not to just make everything work with this. So that's one aspect, video oriented. Silent aperture adjustments, and you can make fine aperture adjustments, is my understanding from what I'm reading in the documentation. Second is the power zoom adapter. Now, the power zoom adapters don't come with the lens. There's two of them. There's a $1,000 one and a $1,200 one. The difference, as far as I can tell, between the $1,000 one and the $1,200 one is that the $1,200 one has a 20-pin connector that you can hook up to cinema cameras, and the $1,000 one only works through the lens interface and the connector on the lens and so forth, so that it will work on like an R5C or something like that. Both of them appear, as far as I can tell, to require USB-C power to drive them, or at least they have a USB-C port that is compatible with the Canon power USB-C power adapter. So that's going to be an indication of power, but you have a dial on the power zoom adapter to control zoom speed, and then you have a rocker to zoom in and out. Additionally, there is I don't remember now if it came with the lens or if it was an optional accessory. There is a lens support for mounting to your rails in a railed cinema camera rig or video rig. as well as the lens foot for just like shooting off a tripod as you might normally would. The lens is also being marketed as having electronic focus stability when zooming, so it's parfocal, but it's being done electronically. This is probably a function that most of Canon's lenses do now anyway, most of the RF lenses. In my testing and in testing from like thedigitalpicture.com, most of the lenses stay focused where you focus them as you zoom, but it just isn't called out on most of the lenses. Calling this out on this lens, again, is a big thing that indicates point for video, or that this is being focused on for video. Now, the big question to me on this is whether or not this is going to, how they're handling breathing. If they have optically corrected focus breathing in the lens, this is going to be a phenomenal lens that is worth every bit of the $3,000 that Canon's asking for it. If it is, again, if you're a video shooter, if they're relying on electronic breathing correction, or it's fairly well corrected with the last bit electronic, which I guess I'd put that in the first category, but either of the second two categories, I still think it's going to be a good lens. But like I said, the real question here is, to me at least, is what is this lens doing with respect to breathing? How well is that corrected? Because that is the, as far as I'm concerned, hurdle in video. Even like parfocal stability is great, and I would say that that's a should have function on a video lens, but breathing correction or a minimal breathing is something that I think is an absolute must-have on a video lens. So something like the RF 28-70, which I love that lens, but it has like breathes like 20% shift in focal length in some places, or 26% at some focal lengths. That is really hard to work with when you're shooting video, and all of a sudden everything is shifting around ridiculously. So this may very well be, like, if this is well corrected that way, and I say not relying on electronic breathing correction. I think I did a podcast talking about this. If not, I should do one. Yeah, I did talk about this in the why 60 megapixels, or my R5 Mark II wish list, and why 60 megapixels is not quite enough resolution to completely correct breathing electronically in that theoretical camera or hypothetical camera. And electronic breathing correction can be fine if you have enough sensor resolution to work with it. The R5 or the R6 at 24 megapixels, 6K wide sensor, only shoots 4K output resolution. There's like 50% extra resolution that can be used for breathing correction. But when you start getting into, the C70, the R5, the R5C, even the R3 shooting RAW, which of course breathing correction isn't going to work with RAW anyway. But at least the cinema cameras, they're not oversampling anywhere near as much as, say, the R3 or R6 Mark II do. And breathing correction then becomes either you can't use it at 8K or whatever the highest resolution is. You wouldn't be able to use it at 4K on a C70 or 8K on an R5 or R5C, or you are cropping in and enlarging, which is going to hurt your image quality. So it can be done. It certainly is something that's possible, but given the choice, I'd rather have the lens not have the breathing in the first place. Now, image stabilization, it is image stabilized, has all three of Canon's modes. So mode 1, which is static, mode 2, which is panning, and mode 3, where the image stabilizer only engages when the frame is being shot, not while you're in a regular kind of thing. I really should spend some time playing with mode 3 and seeing if that does something with video. Again, it's a video lens, but I guess they had the room, software, whatever. It's possible that mode 3 on video, the only lenses that I have that do mode 3 are my 100 to 400 Mark II and EF mount and my 100 to 500, and I don't shoot a lot of video with them, and I almost never have them in mode 3 in the first place, so I'm not 100% certain how that actually works, and I should really take a second and look into that at some point. But it has all 3 modes. It also has a focus limiter, which I thought was kind of interesting. Ranges are 1 meter to infinity or 0.45 meters to infinity, which is the full range. In a video application, a meter is close enough to the lens that it's not, shouldn't really be a problem. In fact, I'm probably about a meter away from my camera right now, and I think it's probably okay. L series, obviously, so it's weather sealed, tripod mount, and as I said, there's a video lens support. Uses the Nano USM motor, which if you've used that in the lenses that have it, it's quiet, it's good, it works well. Wouldn't complain about, or I don't see any reason to complain about Nano USM. Like I said, the biggest consideration is going to be, again, image quality. We will see, but this is an L lens, and at $3,000, it's not going to be a bad L lens, because that would be a real problem in terms of Canon and product design. And for what it's targeting as being sort of the premium 100 or sort of general purpose, as I said, video lens, that's a big deal. Now, I do have a con on this before I kind of wrap up my thoughts. And the con on this is they put gears for the zoom ring so that the power zoom unit could interface with it. And I'm pretty confident, if you look at the specs, it's hard to make an argument that this isn't intended for video shooters, at least 50+% of the market space, I guess you could say. Why not have the standard Mod 8 gears on all the control rings on the lens? This is what follow focuses use, and quite honestly, I don't see why. This is a place where I think Canon could really kind of distinguish themselves, especially for the video / creator end of the community, is putting focus ring or Mod 8 gear rings on all of their lenses, even if it's just molded into the ring at the end, would really make it so much easier to take these things and put these on a rig with a follow focus. And, I know people will say, well, if you're using a follow focus, why aren't you using a cinema lens? And the answer to that is, I'm standing in front of the camera right now, not behind it. I don't have a camera operator, but when I'm behind the camera, I shoot manual focus. So half of the content I shoot, I'm going to be shooting autofocus because I'm in front of the camera, and half of the content I shoot with nobody behind it, and half of the content or so that I shoot, I'm going to be behind the camera, probably shooting manual focus, where I would want that kind of control. Molding it into the plastic is not complicated. Well, it's not expensive. It doesn't undercut something. Nobody's going to say, well, I'm not buying the cinema blah 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 Canon lens that's in PL mount and blah 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 so that I can buy a cheaper RF mount lens that has some gears molded into it. But for a lot of us that are doing video work where, it's kludgy to have to put a focus ring, a gear ring around the focus ring on our lenses. And I think that could be integrated so much more cleanly into the lens out of the box, especially if you don't want to do it on if Canon doesn't want to do it on all the lenses, that's fine. But especially on a lens like this, that's so clearly tailored for video users, having it would be a really big deal. Or positive feature, I should say. Now, summing it up on this, because I wanted to talk about this one the most, this is very much a sign me up lens. I shoot all of my videos, at least with the teleprompter, on a 24-70 f2.8 IS2 EF lens. And as you know, if you have any experience with any of Canon's 24-70s, barring the really first one, but even that extended, it just extended in the reverse direction, All of these lenses extend, and when you're working with a teleprompter, that's not ideal. A fixed internal focus, internal zoom lens is really ideal for putting a camera in a rig and having it work. If I can figure out how to swing it, this would be like the perfect cinema lens for me. So it's fast, which is what I want. I want a 2.8 lens because you can always stop it down, but if you need to let more light in, you can't open it up. You have to up the ISO, and then you get into more noise. It's internal focus, internal zoom. It's got a reasonably good range. Not going to say it's the best range, but at 24 to 105 at 2.8 is a pretty good range for a lot of video applications. It's got a reasonably close focusing distance. 45 centimeters is 1.5 ish, so 18 inches, which, I mean, that's not macro, but that is definitely workable. The fact that it's image stabilized means that if you're shooting on an R5C or a C70, you get some image stabilization without having to rely on the electronic stuff, which works for some applications, but not every. And again, the real question here is breathing. If it's really well controlled, and the 24 to 70 does a pretty good job with it, but if it's really well controlled, then this is sort of a pretty killer lens. At least I'm looking at it that way, like for my application. So, if you've seen the announcements for these Canon lenses, or you have some thoughts on them, or they're interesting to you, or something else that's interesting about them to you, because I know I didn't cover everything here, drop a comment below. If this seems like you might be, or you enjoyed this, or you found this interesting, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, please consider sharing this if you found it interesting or insightful. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And of course, if you'd like to directly support the channel and future content like this, please consider hitting that thanks button or buying some gear from one of our affiliate links in the description. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.